Welcome back. This is the fifth mini video part of the lecture on Chapter 14, thinking about the connections between aggregate demand and GDP. So we're going to fast forward back to where we left off, which was talking about how a change in expenditure translates into a change in equilibrium income. So the key to remember is that whether we're talking about an increase in expenditure, as in this slide, where an increase in consumption independent of income led to an increase in income-induced consumption, because we assume that expenditure in this economy is earned somewhere else, or we're talking about a decrease in expenditure, which is where we talk about how a change in investment expenditure could lead to a decrease in equilibrium income. The idea here is the same. A change in spending will have an initial impact on GDP. That's this leap from our original curve to our new one, whether it's a negative change or a positive one. But then the subsequent change in income-induced consumption is going to increase the overall effect of the change in spending on overall GDP. So this is the notion of the multiplier. We assume that an initial change in spending will have an immediate direct effect on GDP, whether it's an increase or a decrease, but that the consumption-induced expenditure that follows, whether it is more or less, will ultimately increase or multiply the effect of that change in spending on overall GDP. How much should equilibrium income change? Well, we're going to start by assuming that taxes are equal to zero, there's no government expenditure, and that net exports are equal to zero. So this is really just an exercise in algebra. If aggregate output is equal to C0 plus I0 plus the marginal propensity to consume times Y minus T, and we substitute 0 in for T, we can work this out. Y, aggregate income, is going to be equal to autonomous consumption spending plus autonomous investment spending plus the marginal propensity to consume times income. That's basically what these next two lines show. So now we want to solve for Y, basically. We want to see how a change in spending is going to affect Y as a whole. So we isolate income, or Y, on one side of this equation. So what we're going to do now is subtract C1 times Y from both sides. So I didn't write this step out, but basically that's what brings us to the fourth line of this equation. Income minus the marginal propensity to consume times income is now equal to autonomous consumption expenditure plus autonomous investment expenditure. So we can now factor Y out because it's in both components of this. So Y multiplied by 1 minus C1, or the marginal propensity to consume, is now equal to C0 and I0. Now, you may recall that 1 minus C1, 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume, is equal to the marginal propensity to save. What that means is that any change in Y is going to be equal to 1 over the marginal propensity to save, or 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume, multiplied by any change in autonomous spending by households or autonomous spending by firms. One over the marginal propensity to save is the multiplier. So if the marginal propensity to consume is 75%, then the marginal propensity to save is 25%. 1 over the marginal propensity to save is equal to 4. So what that effectively means is that any change in autonomous spending, whether that's C0 or I0, is going to have 4 times the effect on overall GDP. If autonomous consumption increases by 1 million, then equilibrium GDP should increase by 4 million, or 4 times 1 million. If investment expenditure decreases by 1 million, then equilibrium output Y star is going to decrease by 4 million, which is equal to 4 times 1 million. What are the factors that influence autonomous demand? And what effect should they have on GDP in general? All else equal. Well, we expect that anything that encourages households or firms to spend is going to have a positive effect on equilibrium GDP, and anything that causes households or firms to spend less will ultimately decrease equilibrium GDP. So anything that encourages more autonomous spending, such as increased optimism or lower interest rates, is going to encourage growth in the economy. Increased optimism encourages households to spend more, may also encourage firms to spend more, and that, as a whole, is going to increase equilibrium GDP. Lower interest rates make it cheaper for firms to borrow, which we assume is going to be good for business. We assume that will increase investment expenditure and should lead to an increase in equilibrium GDP. Now, the opposite should happen if we have increased pessimism or higher interest rates. Increased pessimism imply less autonomous spending by households or by firms or both, and higher interest rates discourage borrowing. We would assume that would lead to a decrease